May we praise you, O Lord, with heart and hand and voice, and since life itself is your gift to us, then may all that we are be yours.
Hello and welcome to our first in the series of communication from St. Carthage's to you. Now, the way we'll run this program will be to have a little word of welcome. We'll read the Gospel of the nearest Sunday and then the homily or sermon that I would usually give in at church at St. Carthage's. And after that, the reading and the homily, a little prayer, and then finally a few little community notices. So let's begin. So we take the Bible and we read from the Gospel that will be read in the coming days in our churches this Sunday, and it's the story from John's Gospel where the Jesus touches the life of Lazarus, Martha, and Mary, the old story of the one that Jesus raises from the dead. The resurrection of Lazarus. There was a sick man named Lazarus of Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. It was Mary, the sister of the sick man Lazarus, who anointed the Lord with ointment and wiped his feet with her hair. The sisters sent this message to Jesus: "Lord, the one you love is sick." Now, on hearing this, Jesus said, "This sickness will not lead to death, but is for God's glory, so that through it the Son of Man may be glorified." Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. Yet when he heard that he was sick, he stayed where he was for 2 more days. And after this, he said to the disciples, "Let us go back to Judea." And the disciples said, "Rabbi, just now the Jews are trying to stone you. Are you going back there again?" Jesus replied, "Are there not 12 hours in the day? No one who walks in the daytime stumbles, having the light of this world to see by. Anyone who walks around at night stumbles, having no light as a guide." He said that, and then added, "Our friend Lazarus is at rest. I'm going to wake him up." The disciples said to him, "Lord, is he at rest? He will be saved." Jesus had been speaking of the death of Lazarus, but they thought that by rest he meant sleep. So Jesus put it to them plainly: "Lazarus has died, and for your sake I am glad I was not there, so that you may believe. But let us go to him." Then Thomas, known as the twin, said to the other disciples, "Let us also go to die with him." Now, on arriving, Jesus found that Lazarus had been in the tomb for 4 days already. Bethany is only about 3 kilometers from Jerusalem, and many Jews had come to Martha and Mary to comfort them about their brother. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went to meet him. Mary remained sitting in the house. Martha said to Jesus, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But even now I know that God will grant whatever you ask of him." Jesus said to her, "Your brother will rise again." Martha said to him, "I know he will rise at the resurrection on the last day." Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. Anyone who believes in me, even though that person dies, will live. And no one who lives and believes in me will ever die. Do you believe this? She said, Yes, Lord, I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, the one coming into this world. And when she had said this, she went and called her sister Mary, saying quietly, The Master's here and is calling you. Hearing this, Mary got up quickly and went to him. Jesus had not yet come into the village. He was still at the place where Martha had met him. The Jews who were there in the house comforting Mary, seeing her get up quickly and go out, followed her, thinking that she was going to the tomb to weep there. When Jesus came to where Jesus was, seeing him, she fell at his feet, crying, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come with her also, he was distressed in spirit and profoundly moved. He said, Where have they laid him? They said, Lord, come and see. Jesus wept. And the Jews said, See how he loved him. Some of them said, Could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have prevented this man from dying? Again, inwardly distressed, Jesus reached the tomb. It was a cave closed by a stone. Jesus said, Take the stone away. Martha, the dead man's sister, said to him, Lord, there is already a stench. He has been dead for 4 days. Jesus replied, Have I not told you that if you believe, you will see the glory of God? So they took the stone away. Then Jesus lifted up his eyes and said, Father, I thank you for hearing my prayer. I myself knew that you would hear me always, but I speak for the sake of all the crowd standing around me, so that they may believe that you sent me. And when he had said this, he cried in a loud voice, Lazarus, come out. The dead man came out, his feet and hands bound with strips of material, and his face wrapped in a cloth. Jesus said to them, Unbind him and let him go. Many of the Jews who had come to visit Mary and had seen what he did believed in him, but some of them went to the Pharisees to tell them what Jesus had done. And the chief priests and the Pharisees called a meeting and said, What are we going to do? This man is working many signs. If you let him go on in this way, everybody will believe in him, and the Romans will come and take from us the holy place in our nation. One of them, Caiaphas, who was the high priest that year, said, You know nothing at all. You have not worked out that it is better for you that one man should die for the people rather than that the whole nation should perish. He did not speak in his own person, but as high priest of that year. He was prophesying that Jesus was to die for the nation. Gospel of the Lord. Well, there we have the Gospel for this Sunday. And there's been a series of Gospels through Lent, starting with the story of Jesus in the desert being tempted, Transfiguration, And then we've moved to these great emblematic stories like the woman at the well, the man born blind, and this one of Lazarus being raised from the dead. Incidentally, Ambrose of Milan, one of the early bishops of the church, did a whole catechesis or a preparation of those wanting to become Christian through this set of gospel stories. So the first thing to notice, of course, is that obviously the story in its focus is a proclamation for us that Jesus is a life giver. Pretty obvious, whether we accept that or not, that's the status or the standard of the storyline. But we have to remember that when we talk about Jesus raising someone from the dead, it's fairly outstanding in its way. It's all right to say the first sign of Cana in Galilee, where Jesus turns water to wine, and this story is all about the new wine that's offered through the way of the Lord. Then we can move to a story like Jesus meets the woman at the well, the man born blind. But when we get to the story about Jesus actually raising someone from the dead, we might be inclined to say, look, he couldn't do that. Stories like Jesus walking across water are fairly easy to translate into a sense that he walked across the turmoil of the waves and the sinking boat to be the stable, steadying one. It's metaphor. But when we get to a story like, could he really raise, as one born amongst us, that he could perform this extraordinary miracle about raising someone from the dead, there may be questions within some of our hearts. So just to reflect upon the story, where did it come from? We know it's all about proclaiming Jesus as the life giver, but where did this narrative, this story come from? Now, as we often say, the gospel is not a series of diary entries. They're proclamations to bring us the good news about Jesus. Some of them are very historical, others are really composed by the evangelist, Matthew, Mark, Luke and John, and people close with them that are put together to proclaim the good news. So with that in mind, let's look at the mix going on here. See, Jesus has been working amongst them. He has now died for the things he stood for. He's now risen from the dead. This is some decades on, and the canny evangelist said, we've got to write some of this down so it will be kept and treasured, and it will evoke faith. It will remind people of the good news. So we're possibly dealing with some intimate moments in Jesus' life when his presence, his power, was able to turn people's lives around. He may or may not have raised anyone from the dead. That's our response if we want to consider it. Physically, that's an option. On the other hand, there's certainly moments in Jesus' ministry, in his public life, when he's turned people's lives around from something pretty deadly and ghastly to a revitalized person. Now, that's where we begin. Now, along the way, people may have gone from rumours and stories like he was a life giver to saying explicitly he had raised one or many or some from the dead. And that then becomes a gospel story. Remember that in Luke, we're reading John this morning, but in Luke we have a character called Lazarus. And Lazarus is the poor man outside the gate. Now maybe the storytellers use that image of Lazarus, which is in a synoptic, a very different style of gospel, in John. Because when you start to look at this narrative, it's much easier when you look at the text rather than listen to it. It's very messy. There's all sorts of bits and pieces added. If you've ever had that conversation with someone and you're talking to someone on the phone and someone's in the room with you and they're adding bits in and you're saying, wait on a minute, what did you say? What did you say? There's that sort of thing happening when you look closely at this gospel, that there's bits being added from all over the place. And they're added from followers of John, the beloved disciple. Raymond Brown, a great exegete or scholar of the Gospels, John in particular, says that there may have been about 5 Johns that worked on a gospel over a period of time. So bits are added, and they're always smart summations of what Jesus was about, that he wished to walk in the light and to dispel darkness, possibly added. When he talked about he and the Father are one. There's all these interventions that have got put into the text. Now, that's very interesting pastorally, because in our search for the one who matters and for the things that matter in life, we throw in from experiences in life, particularly affirming moments when we're searching for faith after a miscarriage, after a cot death, after a horrendous accident, after even the death of someone we have loved who had a rich and wonderful life, and they die in very senior years, but there's an awful silence. We will never speak or hear their voice again in this world. So, over a period of time, we do what Gospels do, that we throw into the mix, as we think of Jesus as a life giver, various bits and pieces of our own lives that we connect with the gospel proclamation. So we do the patch-ups in our own heart and in our own way of consciousness. Now, you can say, the skeptic says, well, all that is you're delusioning yourself. There's none of that happens at all. You just make it up to feel better. That's what Freud and Marx would say. And they could see examples where people didn't have a handle on life, so they invented meanings to things. What we're saying is the believer and the searcher does not invent, but takes the risk of combining our perceptions of how we see life and how our faith value, commitment to the way of Jesus. It wobbles around, but in the end we settle on certain sorts of stands in life. And that's where this wonderful narrative makes sense. There's all sorts of bits and pieces added over a period of time, over a period of maybe 50 or 60 years from when the seeds of this narrative started to be gathered at the table. They didn't have Gospels as they celebrated Eucharists. They start to talk about these things. Then they break up and come back together in another week for the Lord's Day, and bits more were added. And there are other communities, and they learn bits from one another. All of it not constructing a falsehood, but responding through their own stories to where deadly and awful times were somehow resolved through faith in the Lord as the life giver. Finally, I want to say something about a marvellous Anglican priest and poet, Iris Thomas. He died in the year 2000, so 20 years ago. But he was a remarkable pastor in Wales, and he was a superb poet. In one of his poems, he talks about going into a cold stone church, his parish church in Wales. It was winter. It's round about Easter time, so it's about this time of the year there. And if you know Wales, it can be very, very cold. And he sits in one of the front seats of his church, and they call the area between where the pews are and where the sanctuary starts the chancel steps. And he's looking at the cold stone of the steps, and he thinks they rolled away a stone. And he's thinking, how can I possibly believe that they rolled away a stone and a dead, decomposing body of Lazarus was brought back to life? And it occurs to him in his searching meditation that that's what's happening to him here. He's rolling back the stone of unbelief to see and to believe and to dare to say for himself, yes, Lord, you have rolled back the stone again, and I believe. So we put that into a prayer. Lord, as we take this journey of life, with all its ups and downs, with all the fears of the virus at the moment, with all the tensions it may raise, may we constantly, quietly roll back the stone of skepticism to see your presence with us. This is the word of the Lord. Well, just to finish up, I just want to give you a couple of examples of bits and pieces happening around the parish. The guy that's actually recording this with me, Roger Rasool, Associate Prof Physics at the University of Melbourne, has just been telling me about his work at the moment. He's a very skilled teacher, but he's not teaching, and in fact he's not researching as he usually does, but he's flat out working with a group of scholars stretching across to Harvard in Massachusetts, to people here in Australia who are trying to work out a way of constructing and supplying a significant number of ventilators that would help in the support of people desperately ill with the virus. Planning now to efficiently get them in time, hopefully, to be lifesavers. So one of our parishes up to that. Another story. Our parish council that met in the last week said our church doors are closed, but can we as a people be open? So they've decided to put on our website, St. Carthage's parish, Parkville. Go into Google and you see it. They put there a series of resources that may have help in this time of the virus and our isolation. So if you wish a daily mass or a Sunday mass, they'll be there. One last note of care that you may be able to help out on. We have parishioners that have two little boys. They live in the Kensington suburb here in Melbourne, and one of the little lads, he's about 6 now, has autism, and they just need some rest. So the idea is they're quite willing to pay for a small flat or an apartment or a room that they could have rest in when both of them are professionally working, besides looking after their boys. And if we could find a place that may be a bungalow, or it could be a house that would have access without disturbing the household to a room where they could work, obviously access to a bathroom and toilet, please let me know. And our number is 9347 2493. Well, stay safe, keep well, and I look forward to seeing you again in the next of our series of speaking to you from our parish, St. Carthage's in Parkville.
Like a bird